At exactly 12:07 a.m., the porch light snapped on. Michael White set 2 suitcases on the concrete and opened the door wide. Stephanie White stood there, triplets bundled against her chest, their breaths uneven in the cold. "This isn't your house anymore," he said loud enough for the camera to hear, quiet enough to sound certain. A doorbell blinked red. A curtain across the street moved. What Michael did not know was that at that moment, the house had already begun returning to its rightful owner. The law was awake, and it had been listening. If you believe silence can carry strength, stay with this story. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if stories about quiet justice matter to you, consider subscribing. Some truths don't need shouting to be heard. Before the night, Michael White opened the door and told her to leave. Stephanie White had already learned how to disappear without moving. It was a skill she did not know she was developing at first. It arrived gradually, the way silence does when it is rewarded. Each time she spoke less, the house grew calmer. Each time she asked fewer questions, Michael seemed more satisfied. Over the years, quiet became her safest posture. Stephanie had once been articulate, precise, with words, the kind of woman who took notes during meetings and followed up with emails that tied loose ends together. She had worked in operations for a mid-sized logistics firm in Ohio, a job that required tracking timelines, anticipating failures, documenting decisions. When she married Michael, she assumed those habits would carry forward into their life together. They did not. Michael preferred certainty, not process. He liked statements, not discussions. Early in the marriage, he took over the finances temporarily. He said just until they settled in. Stephanie let it happen. She was pregnant with their first child, then exhausted, nauseous, convinced that cooperation was the same as trust. The temporary arrangement never ended. By the time Stephanie became pregnant again, unexpectedly, and this time with triplets, Michael controlled every account attached to their names. Her paycheck, when she still had one, went into a joint account she could see but not access freely. Later, when complications forced her to stop working altogether, even visibility disappeared. He paid the bills. He handled the mortgage. He reminded her casually and often that he was the one keeping the lights on. The house reflected that dynamic. It was a 2-story colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac, beige siding, a maple tree in the front yard that turned deep red every fall. Michael called it my place when he talked to friends. When contractors came, he signed the paperwork alone. When mail arrived, addressed to both of them, he opened it first. Stephanie noticed these things. She always did. She simply stopped commenting on them. The pregnancy with the triplets was not gentle. Stephanie was placed on partial bed rest by her second trimester, then full bed rest not long after. Her body swelled painfully. Sleep came in fragments. Hospital visits became routine. Michael attended the first few appointments, then stopped coming altogether, citing work deadlines and traffic. "You've got this," he told her once, already halfway out the door. "Women do this every day." Stephanie stopped asking him to come. She began writing again instead. Not journaling, nothing emotional, nothing reflective. Just facts. Appointment dates, doctor names, medication changes, comments Michael made in passing that felt important, though she could not yet explain why. She signed. She kept the notes in the plain folder inside a drawer in the nursery, beneath stacks of unopened diapers and folded onesies. When the triplets arrived early, the hospital room filled with machines and alarms. Stephanie remembered the fluorescent lights, the clipped voices of nurses, the pressure in her chest as they wheeled her into surgery. Michael arrived late. He stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes on his phone, while the babies were taken to the NICU. After that, everything moved quickly and slowly at the same time. Stephanie came home weak, stitched, still learning how to sit up without pain. The babies came home in stages, each one bringing relief and new fear. The house grew louder, messier, heavier. Michael grew more distant. He complained about the noise, the clutter, the cost. At night, when the babies finally slept, Stephanie would sit in the dark living room, listening to the refrigerator hum, replaying Michael's words from earlier in the day. She did not argue with them. She cataloged them. "You don't contribute anymore. This isn't what I signed up for. I can't do everything myself." He said these things as statements of fact, not accusations. That made them harder to contest. The argument that led to the midnight expulsion did not begin as an argument at all. It started with a question Stephanie asked quietly, holding one baby while the other two slept nearby. "Can I see the bank account?" she said, "just to understand where we are." Michael looked at her as if she had asked something unreasonable, even offensive. "Why?" he said. "So I can plan," she replied, "for the babies." He laughed then, not loudly, just a short breath through his nose. "You don't need to worry about that," he said. "I've got it handled." Something in his tone made Stephanie press further. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply asked again. The shift was immediate. Michael's face tightened, his words sharpened. He began listing expenses, sacrifices, everything he believed he had done alone. Stephanie listened. When she tried to speak, he cut her off. When she fell silent, he mistook it for defeat. "You know what," he said eventually. "If you don't trust me, maybe you shouldn't be here." Stephanie looked at the clock on the wall. It was after midnight. One baby stirred against her chest. "I'm not trying to fight," she said. Michael stood up. "I am," he replied. What followed unfolded with mechanical efficiency. Michael went upstairs. He pulled suitcases from the closet. He threw clothing inside without folding. Stephanie did not chase him. She wrapped blankets around the babies one by one, her movements careful, despite the pain in her abdomen. She did not ask where she was supposed to go. When Michael opened the front door, the cold rushed in. The porch light illuminated the driveway, the empty street beyond. Stephanie stepped forward because there was nowhere else to step. She noticed the red blink of the doorbell camera. She noticed the neighbor's porch across the street, the faint outline of a curtain shifting. These details anchored her, even as everything else seemed unreal. "This isn't your house anymore," Michael said. Stephanie did not correct him. She did not say what she knew or what she suspected or what she would soon confirm. She adjusted the blanket around the baby closest to her heart and walked down the steps. Only after the door closed did she feel the full weight of what had happened. She stood there. For several seconds, the cold biting through her thin shoes, the baby's breaths fogging the air. Then she turned and walked toward the street, toward whatever came next. Inside the house, Michael locked the door and went to bed convinced of his authority. Outside, Stephanie began a process she would not rush, could not rush, and did not need to announce. The law, unlike Michael, did not require volume to recognize truth. Stephanie White did not remember how long she stood at the edge of the driveway after the front door closed. Time flattened in the cold, stretching and compressing at once. What she remembered instead were fragment sensations that lodged themselves into her body, as if they belonged there now. The weight of 3 infants pressed against her chest and arms, uneven and shifting. The sharp sting of air against skin still tender from surgery. The faint vibration of a passing car somewhere far off its headlights, briefly washing the houses in pale light before disappearing again. The street was quiet in the way suburban streets often are after midnight. Too quiet to feel accidental. Porch lights dotted the block like watchful eyes. Somewhere down the cul-de-sac, a dog barked once and then stopped. Stephanie adjusted her grip, tightening the blanket around the smallest of the 3 babies. She did this automatically, without thinking, her body responding, before her mind could catch up. She had learned quickly that if she paused to consider fear, it would bloom. Action kept it contained. Across the street, a curtain shifted. Mrs. Helen Carter lived there. Stephanie knew her only in pieces, a polite wave when taking out the trash, a brief exchange about the weather, a Christmas card left in the mailbox each year without fail. They had never shared a meal. They had never shared a secret. But Stephanie felt the weight of being seen. The doorbell camera blinked again, its red light steady, unblinking. It did not look away when Michael turned his back. It did not look away when Stephanie stepped off the porch. She wondered briefly how much it recorded. Sound, obviously. Motion. Timestamps. She filed the thought away the way she filed everything else now. She walked. The sidewalk was uneven, one slab lifted slightly by the roots of the maple tree. Stephanie knew this because she had tripped on it once months earlier, when her balance was already compromised by pregnancy. Tonight, she stepped over it carefully, aware that falling was not an option. Not with this weight, not with this responsibility. Halfway down the block, one of the babies began to cry. A thin, fragile sound that cut through the quiet like glass. Stephanie stopped. She rocked gently, murmuring something soft and nonsensical, the kind of sound that had no words but carried intention. The baby's cries softened, then stilled. Stephanie exhaled slowly, the breath trembling despite her effort to control it. She did not cry. Crying required space. It required safety. She would not allow herself that yet. At the corner of the street, she paused again. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Then she pulled it out. A message from Michael. "You can come back tomorrow to get your things. Don't make a scene." Stephanie stared at the words until they lost their meaning. Then she took a screenshot. She noted the time. She locked the phone. A few minutes later, another vibration. "If you involve anyone else, I'll make this difficult." She did not reply. She took another screenshot, another timestamp. By the time she reached the gas station at the edge of the neighborhood, her arms were burning. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed loudly, aggressively bright after the darkness of the street. A young man behind the counter looked up as the door chimed, his eyes widening slightly when he saw her. "Ma'am," he said, "are you okay?" Stephanie nodded once. She did not trust her voice. "I just need to sit," she said finally. He gestured toward a plastic chair near the window without asking questions. Stephanie lowered herself into it carefully, wincing despite her effort to hide the pain. She checked the babies again. All three were quiet now, their faces red and scrunched, unaware of the night they were being carried through. She sat there for nearly 20 minutes. No one approached her again. She was grateful for that. Eventually, she stood. Her phone vibrated once more, this time with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. "Stephanie White," a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Officer Daniels with the County Police Department. We received a call from a concerned neighbor regarding a domestic situation." Stephanie closed her eyes briefly. "I'm not in danger right now," she said, "but I was asked to leave my residence with my children." There was a pause on the line. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" Officer Daniels asked. "Yes," Stephanie said, though at that moment it was more hope than fact. "All right," the officer replied. "If you need assistance retrieving belongings or documentation later, you can request a civil standby. I'll note this call." Stephanie thanked her and ended the call. She added the officer's name to her notes. The motel was 20 minutes away, just off the interstate. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. The clerk barely glanced up as Stephanie checked in, his eyes skimming over the babies without comment. She was grateful again for indifference this time. Inside the room, she set the carriers down gently and locked the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place sent a wave of exhaustion through her, so intense she had to sit on the edge of the bed to keep from swaying. The babies slept. Stephanie sat there in the dim light, listening to their breathing, feeling the ache in her body finally catch up with her. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small notebook she had carried for months now. She opened to a blank page. 12:07 a.m., Michael told me to leave. Exact words, "This isn't your house anymore." 12:09 a.m., doorbell camera recording active. 12:14 a.m. Message received, "Don't make a scene." 12:18 a.m. Threat of retaliation if I involve others. She wrote slowly, carefully. Her handwriting was steady. When she finished, she closed the notebook and set it beside her. Only then did she allow herself to lean back against the headboard, her eyes closing for a moment longer than intended. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. From David Reynolds, attorney at law. Subject: please confirm receipt estate matter. Stephanie stared at the screen. She did not open it yet. Instead, she placed the phone face down on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay down beside her children. One hand rested lightly against the nearest carrier fingers, splayed protectively. Outside trucks roared past on the interstate, unaware of the quiet shift that had already begun. Michael believed the night had ended with a locked door. Stephanie knew better. This was only the beginning. Morning arrived without ceremony. Stephanie White woke before dawn, not because she was rested, but because one of the babies shifted in her sleep, releasing a soft, unsettled sound that pulled Stephanie back into consciousness instantly. For a moment, disorientation pressed in an unfamiliar ceiling, the faint smell of detergent and old air. Then memory returned, precise and uninvited. The motel room was still dim, the curtains barely holding back the early gray light. Stephanie sat up slowly, her body protesting the movement. Pain radiated through her abdomen, a reminder she had not been given time to recover properly. She breathed through it the way the nurses had taught her. The babies slept on. She checked each one carefully, the ritual grounding her. Tiny chests rising and falling. Warm skin, no fever, no distress. When she was satisfied, she stood and moved to the small bathroom sink to wash her hands, wincing again as she straightened. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her face looked thinner than it had weeks earlier, her eyes ringed with shadows that makeup could not have hidden, even if she'd had any. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, strands escaping around her temples. She did not look broken. She looked compressed, like something that had been forced into a smaller space than it was meant to occupy. Stephanie turned away from the mirror and focused on what came next. She fed the babies one after another, the room filling with the quiet sounds of sucking and breathing. She counted ounces. She timed intervals. These were things she could control. When her phone buzzed again, she did not jump this time. Another message from Michael. I'll leave the car seats on the porch later. You can pick them up. Don't bring anyone. Stephanie stared at the screen, then took a screenshot. She noted the time. She added it to the growing digital folder she had created during the night, organized by date and category. She did not respond. Instead, she opened the email she had avoided hours earlier. From David Reynolds. Subject: estate of Margaret White. Time sensitive. Stephanie read slowly. Mr. Reynolds wrote with professional restraint, his language careful, deliberate. He explained that he had been attempting to reach her for several weeks regarding her late mother's estate. Certain documents had reached a critical stage, and her confirmation was required to proceed. At the bottom of the email was a sentence that caused Stephanie to stop breathing for a moment. Recent circumstances may have satisfied the triggering conditions outlined in the trust. Stephanie set the phone down and closed her eyes. She did not feel relief. Not yet. Relief would imply safety, and she was not there. What she felt instead was alignment pieces clicking together, events taking on shape. Her mother, Margaret White, had been meticulous. She had believed in preparation and redundancy, in leaving nothing vague. Stephanie remembered that now vividly. The late-night conversations before Margaret's illness worsened. The insistence on updating documents. The trust attorney whose name Stephanie had barely listened to at the time. She responded to the email with a single sentence. I can meet today. Mr. Reynolds replied within minutes, proposing an afternoon appointment. The rest of the morning passed in focused motion. Stephanie packed the babies into their carriers and loaded them into the back seat of the car Michael had left in the motel parking lot weeks earlier and never asked about again. She drove carefully, every turn deliberate, her eyes scanning mirrors constantly. She did not believe Michael would follow her, but she did not discount the possibility. The law office was quiet, understated. No glass walls, no intimidating reception desk, just a small waiting area, and a woman in her 40s who greeted Stephanie with a calm nod. I'm Lisa Monroe, she said. I'm Mr. Reynolds' paralegal. Let me help you with the babies. Stephanie hesitated, then allowed it. The carriers were heavy, and her strength was not endless. David Reynolds rose from his desk when Stephanie entered his office. He was older than she had expected, his hair gray at the temples, his posture relaxed but attentive. "I'm sorry for the circumstances," he said simply. Stephanie nodded. She did not trust herself to answer. They did not begin with sympathy. They began with facts. David explained the structure of the trust Margaret White had established years earlier. The house, the one Michael now occupied, had been placed into the trust long before Stephanie married. Ownership had never transferred to Michael despite appearances created by refinancing documents and joint accounts. The trust included protective provisions, David said. They were designed to activate if you were forcibly removed from the property or denied access without due process. Stephanie listened carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Last night, David continued appears to meet that condition. He slid a document across the desk. Stephanie recognized her mother's handwriting immediately on the margins. David did not promise revenge. He did not speak of punishment. He spoke of procedure. There will be steps, he said. Not all of them fast, some of them uncomfortable. But the law is very clear on this point. Stephanie asked questions, precise ones, about timelines, about risks, about custody implications, about how to protect her children while the process unfolded. David answered each one without embellishment. When the meeting ended, Lisa handed Stephanie a folder. Inside were copies of documents Stephanie had not seen in years. "This stays with you," Lisa said. "Make duplicates. Keep them somewhere safe." On the drive back to the motel, Stephanie's phone rang again. Michael's name flashed on the screen. She let it ring. A voicemail followed. "You think you're smart?" Michael's voice said, sharp with irritation. "But you're making a mistake. This will not end the way you think." Stephanie saved the voicemail. That evening, as she fed the babies again, and the sky outside the motel window darkened, Stephanie felt something shift, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. She was no longer reacting. She was preparing. The night before, Michael had believed he was ending something. Stephanie understood now that he had only revealed it. Stephanie White did not return to the motel that night believing she owned a house. She returned understanding something far more precise, that the story Michael had told himself about the house had never been legally complete, and that her mother had anticipated exactly this kind of misunderstanding. The folder Lisa Monroe had handed her sat unopened on the passenger seat as Stephanie drove. She did not trust herself to read it while moving. Instead, she focused on the road, the rhythm of the interstate, the familiar pattern of lane markings sliding past. Motion steadied her. It always had. At the motel, she settled the babies first. Feeding, changing, counting breaths. Only after they slept did she sit at the small table beneath the flickering lamp and open the folder. The documents were not dramatic. There were no bold headings declaring victory. There were dates, signatures, clauses written in language that required patience. Stephanie read slowly, stopping to reread sections, tracing the logic as if she were reconstructing a process map. The house had been purchased by Margaret White more than a decade earlier, long before Michael entered Stephanie's life. It had been paid for outright, no mortgage, no lien. 2 years later, Margaret had transferred the property into a revocable trust, naming Stephanie as the sole beneficiary and outlining specific protections should Stephanie marry or cohabitate. One clause, highlighted in yellow by David Reynolds, stood out. In the event the beneficiary is denied access to the primary residence by a spouse or cohabitating partner without judicial order, the trustee shall act immediately to restore possession. Stephanie leaned back in her chair, her breath catching briefly. She remembered her mother insisting on updating the trust after Stephanie announced her engagement. Margaret had not objected to Michael openly. She had smiled politely, asked practical questions, and then scheduled another meeting with her attorney. "At least let me be useful," Margaret had said then, half joking. Stephanie had not fully understood what that usefulness might look like. Not until now. The refinancing documents Michael had orchestrated years later were included as well, annotated carefully. The trust had never relinquished ownership. Michael's name appeared in places that suggested authority, but did not confer it. Stephanie saw now what she had missed before, not because she was careless, but because she had been tired, pregnant, trusting. The pattern was clear. Michael had built a sense of control on paperwork that gave the appearance of power without its substance. The illusion had held as long as Stephanie stayed silent and compliant. She closed the folder and rested her hands on it, grounding herself in the weight of paper and ink. This was not about reclaiming a house. It was about correcting a record. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Carol White, her mother-in-law. "You should come to your senses. Michael is under a lot of stress. You're making things worse by leaving." Stephanie read the message twice. Then she took a screenshot and archived it. Another message followed, this time from Michael. "The kids need stability. Dragging lawyers into this is selfish." Stephanie did not reply. Instead, she opened a new note in her phone. Communications pattern of minimizing actions. Framing control as concern language. Implying ownership over children. She did not attach emotion to the words. She did not need to. Meaning was embedded already. The next morning, Stephanie drove past the house. She did not stop. She did not slow down. She simply observed. The porch light was off. Michael's car sat in the driveway. The curtains were drawn. She noted the time. At a coffee shop nearby, she met Lisa Monroe again. Lisa brought copies of additional documents Stephanie would need to review filings disclosures. A draft motion related to property access. "This won't be loud," Lisa said, "but it will be firm." Stephanie appreciated that distinction. As they spoke, Stephanie's phone rang. Unknown number. She declined the call. A voicemail arrived seconds later. Stephanie Michael's voice said, "Lower now controlled. We need to talk. This is getting out of hand." She saved the message. "What he means," Lisa said gently, having seen the notification light up, "is that he's losing certainty." Stephanie nodded. That afternoon, Stephanie returned to the motel and found a small package outside her door. Inside were the car seats Michael had mentioned left, without a note. She carried them inside, one by one, her arms trembling with fatigue by the end. She did not thank him. She did not acknowledge the gesture as kindness. It was evidence of contact, nothing more. That evening, as she rocked one of the babies to sleep, Stephanie allowed herself to remember something she had buried. Years earlier, shortly after moving into the house, she had asked Michael whose idea it had been to refinance. It just made sense, he'd said. Why leave money on the table? She had nodded, then the conversation ending as easily as it had begun. Now she saw that moment differently, not as a mutual decision, but as a pivot. A quiet transfer of assumed authority that had relied entirely on her trust and exhaustion. Stephanie kissed the baby's forehead and laid her down gently. The house was still occupied by Michael. The locks were still changed. The walls still held the life Stephanie had built. But the foundation beneath it, all the legal, unmovable foundation, had never been his. And for the first time since the night she was forced into the cold, Stephanie felt the balance shift not in her favor yet, but away from his certainty. Michael believed possession was something you asserted. Stephanie knew now it was something you documented. The next 48 hours unfolded without confrontation. And that was precisely what unsettled Michael White the most. Stephanie White did not send messages demanding explanations. She did not appear at the house with police officers or relatives. She did not announce legal action on social media or ask friends to intervene. From Michael's perspective, she had vanished into silence, and silence, when expected to be panic, felt threatening. For Stephanie, the quiet was not absence. It was structure. She returned to David Reynolds' office the following afternoon, this time without the babies. Lisa Monroe had arranged for a licensed childcare provider to watch them at the motel for a few hours. Stephanie had hesitated before agreeing. Letting go of control even briefly did not come easily anymore. But Lisa had been thorough, providing credentials, references, background checks. Stephanie accepted help the way she accepted everything now, carefully, deliberately, with verification. David had prepared a set of documents neatly stacked on the table when she arrived. He did not rush into explanations. He waited until she was seated, until her attention had fully settled. "There are two paths forward," he said. "One emotional, one procedural." Stephanie did not hesitate. "Procedural," she said. David nodded as if he had expected no other answer. He began outlining the steps. First, formal notice. Then a motion requesting immediate restoration of access to the property under the trust's protective clause. In parallel, filings related to custody and financial disclosure. Each action would generate a record. Each record would narrow Michael's room to maneuver. "There is one thing I need to be very clear about," David said, folding his hands. "This process does not reward haste. It rewards consistency." Stephanie met his gaze. "I can be consistent," she said. David slid another document across the desk. This one was thinner, simpler. "It's a sworn statement," he explained. "Your account of the removal, the words used, the circumstances. We'll attach supporting materials later, but this becomes the spine of the case." Stephanie picked up the pen. As she wrote, she felt the familiar calm that came from translating experience into language that could not be dismissed. She described the time, the words, the presence of the doorbell camera, the condition of her body after childbirth. She did not embellish, she did not soften. When she finished, David read the statement silently. He did not correct her phrasing. He did not ask her to change her tone. "This is strong," he said finally, "because it's restrained." While Stephanie reviewed the next set of documents, her phone vibrated. A notification from her bank. Account access updated. She opened the app. The joint account she had been locked out of now showed a different status, restricted, flagged pending review. A small note indicated that a legal inquiry had been initiated. Stephanie closed the app without reaction. David noticed. "That's the first ripple," he said. "It doesn't feel dramatic, but it matters." On her way back to the motel, Stephanie stopped at a pharmacy to refill prescriptions she had delayed picking up. The clerk asked for her ID. Stephanie handed it over without comment, noting the address printed on it. The house she had been told no longer belonged to her. That too would change. In time. At the motel, the child care provider handed the babies back, gently offering a quiet summary of feeding times and diaper changes. Stephanie listened, thanked her, and locked the door after she left. Later that evening, Michael called again. This time, Stephanie answered. "What are you doing?" he demanded, skipping any pretense of concern. "Taking care of the children," she replied. "You can't just disappear," he said. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Stephanie held the phone slightly away from her ear, not to distance herself emotionally, but to ensure she could hear him clearly. "I didn't disappear," she said. "You told me to leave." "That's not what I meant," Michael snapped. "You know that." Stephanie was quiet for a moment. "Michael," she said finally, "I'm documenting this call." There was a pause. "You're being ridiculous," he said, but his voice had shifted, thinning at the edges. She did not argue. She did not accuse. "I'll communicate through my attorney going forward," she said, and ended the call. She added the call to her notes. The next morning, Lisa Monroe emailed Stephanie a copy of the filed notice. It was concise, unemotional. It stated the facts, cited the trust, and requested compliance. Lisa's message was brief. He's been served. Stephanie read the notice twice, then closed her laptop and turned to the babies who were just beginning to wake. The day would be long. Feedings appointments, careful budgeting. Life continued alongside law. By early afternoon, Michael's reaction arrived. First, a string of text messages, short, erratic, swinging between anger and bargaining. "You're really doing this. Think about the kids. We can fix this without lawyers. You don't know what you're starting." Stephanie did not respond. Then came Carol White's call. Stephanie let it go to voicemail. Stephanie Carroll's voice said, strained but controlled, "This is not how family handles things. You're embarrassing, Michael." Stephanie saved the message. At 3:42 p.m., an email arrived from a loan officer named Andrew Miller addressed to Michael, but copied to Stephanie by mistake, or perhaps not by mistake at all. Subject, clarification needed. Property title status. Stephanie read it once, then forwarded it to David Reynolds. David replied within minutes. Good. Let them ask questions. That evening, as dusk settled outside the motel window, Stephanie bathed the babies and laid them down. She moved more slowly now, aware of her limits. Healing was not something she could postpone forever. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself one deep breath in and out. Michael believed control came from force. Stephanie was learning that control came from alignment between truth documentation and patience. The house was still not hers in practice. The door was still closed to her. But the path back had been mapped. And Michael, whether he understood it yet or not, had already stepped onto it. By the end of the week, Stephanie White's life had narrowed into two parallel tracks that never touched. One was immediate and physical feeding schedules, pediatric appointments, insurance calls, the slow recovery of her body. The other ran quietly beneath it all, legal, procedural, relentless. She moved between them without drama-switching focus the way she once had at work, moving from one system to another without confusing the rules of either. The evidence came together faster than she had expected. Lisa Monroe guided her through the process with methodical patience. Nothing was gathered impulsively. Every piece was logged, labeled, duplicated. Stephanie learned quickly that evidence did not exist in isolation. It only mattered when it could be placed precisely in time and context. The doorbell footage was the anchor. Lisa had requested a copy directly through the manufacturer's legal portal, ensuring the metadata remained intact. When Stephanie watched it again, this time on a large monitor in David Reynolds' conference room, the scene felt different than it had in memory, less emotional, more damning. There was Michael, framed by the porch light, his voice calm, unhurried. This isn't your house anymore. The timestamp glowed clearly in the corner of the screen. Stephanie did not look away. She did not flinch. She noted the angle of the camera, the clarity of the audio, the moment the door closed behind her. The law favored what could be seen and heard without interpretation. Next came the messages. Lisa organized them into a timeline before the removal, during, after. Threats were not labeled as threats. They were simply presented verbatim. Don't make a scene. If you involve anyone else, I'll make this difficult. You're overreacting. Language like this establishes intent, Lisa explained. Not malice, control. Stephanie understood the distinction. Then there were the bank records. David had subpoenaed transaction histories for the joint accounts. The pattern emerged quickly, withdrawals that increased after Stephanie stopped working, credit lines opened without her knowledge, transfers timed around mortgage discussions. Nothing illegal on its face. Everything questionable in aggregate. Stephanie studied the spreadsheets carefully. Here, she said, pointing to a cluster of entries. This was when I was hospitalized. David nodded. That matters. Audio files followed. Voicemails Michael had left over the years, dismissive, irritated, occasionally threatening when she questioned him. Individually, they sounded like marital tension. Together, they formed a consistent tone. Stephanie listened to each one once. She did not need to hear them again. Helen Carter's statement came last. The neighbor had agreed to speak after being contacted by David's office. She was nervous, apologetic for not intervening more directly that night. Stephanie did not resent her for that. Witnessing was its own form of participation. Helen's statement was simple. She had seen Stephanie leave with the babies after midnight, carrying them alone, with suitcases already placed outside. She had heard Michael's voice raised, but had not heard Stephanie respond. She looked like she didn't want to wake them, Helen had said. Stephanie closed the folder containing the statement carefully. That evening, Michael's behavior shifted again. The messages stopped. The calls stopped. Silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not strategic. It was reactive. At 8:17 p.m., Stephanie received an email from Andrew Miller, the loan officer. Subject: follow-up required, urgent. Andrew explained that Michael had attempted to proceed with a home equity loan earlier that week. Title verification had flagged an inconsistency related to trust ownership. The process was paused pending clarification. Stephanie forwarded the email to David. David replied with a single line, exactly as expected. The next morning, a courier delivered a thick envelope to the motel. Stephanie signed for it, noting the time and the sender. Inside were Michael's filings, his response to the notice David had served. It was aggressive in tone, heavy on accusation, light on documentation. Michael framed the situation as abandonment. He implied instability. He claimed sole financial responsibility. Stephanie read the document once, then handed it to Lisa later that day. "He's telling a story," Lisa said. "We're presenting a record." Stephanie preferred records. In the afternoon, she took the babies to a pediatric appointment. The doctor asked routine questions. Stephanie answered calmly. She did not mention the motel unless asked. She did not volunteer explanations. When the doctor asked about home support, Stephanie said simply, "I have what I need right now." It was true. Back at the motel, Stephanie began preparing for the next phase. She organized clothing donations the babies had already outgrown. She updated her resume late at night while they slept, not because she planned to return to work immediately, but because preparedness mattered to her. She also made a list of addresses she would need to update soon. Her phone buzzed again that evening. Unknown number. She let it ring. A voicemail followed. It was Michael's voice, unfamiliar in its restraint. "I don't know what you think you're proving," he said, "but you're going to regret this." Stephanie saved the message and added it to the archive. That night, as rain tapped against the motel window, Stephanie reviewed the evidence one final time. Not with fear, with distance. She could see now what the law would see: a pattern of control, a moment of unlawful removal, and a paper trail that contradicted Michael's version of authority. She thought briefly of the house, the maple tree, the staircase where she had once rested her hand for balance, the nursery she had prepared with such care. Those memories still existed, but they no longer defined the stakes. This was no longer about where she lived. It was about who decided. Michael had believed he could rewrite reality by asserting it loudly enough. Stephanie had learned that reality, when documented, did not require belief to be enforced. The hearing date arrived in her inbox just before midnight. She marked it on her calendar. Then she turned off the light and lay down beside her children, the sound of rain steady and unremarkable, the kind of sound that meant something was being washed clean slowly, without spectacle. The silence Michael White chose after being served did not last. It never did. Stephanie White sensed the shift before it announced itself. Silence, when used as a tactic, carries tension beneath it, pressure building, seeking release. By the second morning, after the evidence packet was finalized, Stephanie could feel that pressure moving outward away from her, and into the spaces Michael still controlled. It surfaced first through other people. A message arrived from a former neighbor. Stephanie barely knew someone she had exchanged pleasantries with years earlier at a block party. "Hey, Michael mentioned you're going through something. Just wanted to check in." Stephanie read the message, then set the phone down without responding. She recognized the shape of it immediately. Concern disguised as curiosity. Curiosity disguised as neutrality. By noon, a second message came, this one. From an old college acquaintance she had not spoken to in nearly a decade. "I heard things are rough. Hope you're taking care of yourself." Stephanie did not need to ask where the information had come from. Michael had begun telling his version. That afternoon, Carol White escalated her efforts. She did not text. She showed up. Stephanie was in the motel room, folding laundry when the knock came. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was firm in the way people knock when they believe they have moral authority. Stephanie checked the peephole. Carol stood outside with her purse clutched tightly against her side, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line of rehearsed disappointment. Stephanie did not open the door. She waited. The knock came again. "Stephanie," Carol called softly. "I know you're in there." Stephanie glanced at the babies sleeping peacefully on the bed. She took a breath and spoke through the door. "I'm not meeting without my attorney," she said. Carol's expression tightened. "This is family," she replied. "You don't need lawyers for family." Stephanie did not argue. "Please leave," she said. For a moment, Carol stood there visibly weighing her next move. Then her voice sharpened. "You're making yourself look unstable," she said. "Dragging infants from place to place. That's not what a good mother does." Stephanie felt the words land. She also felt them fail. "This conversation is being documented," she said calmly. "Please leave." Carol scoffed, shook her head, and turned away, muttering something about ingratitude as she walked down the corridor. Stephanie waited until the elevator doors closed before unlocking her phone and adding the encounter to her notes. Time, location, exact phrasing. She did not cry afterward. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest, but she did not let it bloom into self-doubt. Carol's words were not meant to persuade Stephanie. They were meant to create a record, one that favored Michael. Stephanie already had a better one. That evening, Michael resurfaced publicly. He posted a photograph on social media, the front of the house. The maple tree in autumn, light the caption, carefully vague. "Some people walk away when things get hard. I'm staying strong for my kids." The comments arrived quickly. Supportive, sympathetic, unquestioning. Stephanie saw the post not because she followed Michael, she had stopped long ago, but because 3 different people sent it to her. She did not react. She forwarded screenshots to Lisa Monroe with a brief note. "Public narrative shift." Lisa responded minutes later. "Good. He's committing to aversion." Stephanie appreciated Lisa's perspective. Stories once told publicly became anchors. Changing them later was difficult. The next morning, Michael's attorney filed a supplemental statement. It alleged that Stephanie had left voluntarily, that she had refused to communicate, that her emotional state made reconciliation impossible. David Reynolds reviewed the filing and smiled faintly. "He's contradicting himself," he said. "That helps us." Stephanie sat across from him, her posture straight, her expression neutral. "I don't want this to become a spectacle," she said. "It won't," David replied. "Spectacles require noise. This is paper." Still, the pressure continued. A call came from Child Services, not an investigation, but an inquiry triggered by an anonymous concern. Stephanie answered every question calmly. She provided documentation. She invited verification. The call ended without incident. Stephanie added the time and the caller's name to her notes. That afternoon, Andrew Miller called her directly. "I probably shouldn't be calling you," he said carefully, "but I wanted you to know Michael came by the office." Stephanie waited. He was angry, Andrew continued. He insisted the title issue was a clerical error. He threatened to move his accounts if we didn't fix it immediately. Stephanie imagined the scene clearly, Michael leaning forward, voice lowered, confidence forced, and she asked. Andrew exhaled. "And we don't override trust ownership, not like this." Stephanie thanked him and ended the call. That night, as she rocked one of the babies to sleep, Stephanie felt the first true wave of exhaustion since the process had begun. Not physical this time, emotional. The kind that crept in quietly when vigilance relaxed. She sat on the edge of the bed long after the baby slept, her hand resting lightly against the carrier, her thoughts drifting toward the life she had believed she was building. She allowed herself one moment of grief. Not for Michael, for the version of safety she had trusted without verification. Then she stood, walked to the table, and reviewed the calendar. The hearing was 3 days away. The county recording appointment was already scheduled. The emails were queued. The evidence was complete. Michael could shape narratives. He could recruit voices. He could posture publicly. Stephanie did not need to counter any of it, because when the process moved forward, and it would only one version would remain intact under scrutiny, and it would not be his. She turned off the light and lay down beside her children, the motel room, quiet once more. Outside, traffic moved steadily, indifferent to personal conflicts, carrying people toward destinations, they believed they controlled. Stephanie knew better now. Control was not about staying. It was about knowing when to let systems speak for you. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not with urgency, but with precision. Stephanie White read it at the small table in the motel room while the babies slept, their breathing steady, their bodies still curled in the way newborns seem to prefer. The document itself was unremarkable. No dramatic language, no accusations. It simply stated that a notice of claim had been filed regarding the property at issue and that all parties with a purported interest were required to respond. Michael White received the same notice. The difference lay not in the paper, but in how each of them understood it. For Stephanie, the notice marked a transition. Everything before it had been preparation evidence, gathering documentation alignment. Everything after it would be movement. The system had been engaged, and systems once engaged did not respond to emotion. Michael responded within hours. Not to Stephanie, but to the bank. Andrew Miller forwarded the message that afternoon, adding no commentary of his own. The email from Michael was clipped insistent, laced with irritation. He demanded an immediate resolution to what he described as an administrative error and referenced his long-standing relationship with the institution. Stephanie read the email once, then forwarded it to David Reynolds. David replied shortly after, "He's trying to outrun the paperwork. He won't." By midweek, the title search was underway. Lisa Monroe explained the process during a call, her voice calm and instructional. The county recorder's office would reconstruct the chain of ownership from the original purchase forward, verifying each transfer, each lien, each legal instrument attached to the property. "Think of it like an audit," Lisa said. "They don't care who lives there. They care who has the right." Stephanie appreciated that distinction. The babies stirred as she listened, and she moved instinctively to soothe them. The phone tucked between her shoulder and ear. "What happens if the findings contradict his claims?" Stephanie asked. Lisa did not hesitate. Then his claims stopped mattering. That afternoon, Michael's tone shifted again. He called Stephanie directly for the first time in days. She let it go to voicemail. The message he left was different from the others, measured almost conciliatory. "We're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I talked to a lender friend. This will get sorted out. We should sit down and clear things up before lawyers complicate it." Stephanie listened once, then saved it. She knew what he was doing. This was not an invitation to clarity. It was an attempt to reset the narrative before it finalized. Later that day, David Reynolds sent her a draft of the motion, requesting immediate restoration of access to the property. Stephanie read it carefully, line by line. The language was restrained, factual, unyielding. It cited the trust. It cited the notice. It cited the removal. Stephanie signed electronically and returned it within minutes. That night, she allowed herself a small deviation from routine. She ordered takeout, nothing indulgent, just warm food that did not come from a microwave. She ate quietly while watching the babies sleep, the hum of the television filling the room without meaning. She did not think about Michael. She thought about timing. The county recording appointment was scheduled for Friday morning. On Thursday, the bank inquiry deepened. Andrew Miller called again, his tone careful. "We're placing a temporary hold on any new credit activity tied to the property," he said, pending clarification. Stephanie thanked him. "You should know," Andrew added. He wasn't happy about it. She ended the call and noted the development. Another pressure point, another confirmation. That evening, Carol White tried again. This time it was an email addressed to Stephanie David Reynolds, and an address Carol clearly believed belonged to Stephanie's employer, an outdated contact from years earlier. The email framed itself as concern. It questioned Stephanie's stability, her decision-making, her fitness as a mother under current circumstances. David replied before Stephanie could. "Please direct all communication through counsel. Further unsolicited contact will be documented." Carol did not respond. Friday morning arrived gray and unremarkable. Stephanie did not attend the county recorder's office. She did not need to. David and Lisa were there on her behalf, documents and hand signatures, verified filings prepared. Stephanie spent the morning at a pediatric follow-up appointment, her attention divided between weight charts and feeding schedules. She did not check her phone until she returned to the motel and settled the babies down again. When she did, there were 3 new emails. The first was from Lisa. Recording completed. The second was from Andrew Miller. Loan activity paused. Title confirmed under trust. The third was from Michael. What did you do? Stephanie read the words without reaction. She did not respond. Instead, she opened the banking app again. The joint account now displayed a clear notice account under legal review. Certain functions restricted. She closed the app. An hour later, Michael's attorney filed an emergency motion contesting the trust's authority. David Reynolds received it, reviewed it, and shook his head. He's late, David said during their call, and he's arguing feelings, not law. That afternoon, an email Stephanie had never seen before landed in Michael's inbox and by legal requirement was copied to her counsel. It was an automated notification from the escrow service confirming the updated ownership status and advising all financial institutions of record. The subject line was neutral. The effect was not. Michael called again. This time, Stephanie answered. What did you do? He repeated louder now. I followed procedures, she said. You can't just take the house, he snapped. I didn't, Stephanie replied. I never had to. There was silence on the line. Not strategic this time, genuine. This is my home, Michael said finally. Stephanie's voice remained steady. It's where you lived, she said. That's not the same thing. She ended the call. That night, as the motel room settled into quiet, Stephanie reviewed the calendar once more. The hearing was days away now. The record was complete. The pressure was shifting entirely off her shoulders. Michael had believed power came from certainty unchallenged. Stephanie had learned that certainty, when unsupported, collapsed under its own weight. She turned off the lamp and lay down beside her children, the sound of rain returning softly against the window. Somewhere across town, Michael was confronting a reality he had never bothered to verify. Stephanie slept. The first hearing did not feel like a confrontation. Stephanie White realized that as she sat quietly on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, one hand resting on the handle of the stroller, her eyes fixed on a neutral point on the opposite wall. Courtrooms, she would learn, were not designed for drama. They were designed for order, for the careful sorting of claims into what could be proven and what could not. Michael White arrived 20 minutes late. Stephanie noticed without looking directly at him. The change in air announced his presence before sound did the sudden tension, the subtle shift in posture among the people waiting. Michael wore a tailored suit and the expression he reserved for meetings where he believed he held leverage. He did not look at Stephanie. He positioned himself slightly ahead of her, as if placement alone could reassert hierarchy. His attorney whispered urgently beside him. Michael nodded once dismissively. David Reynolds arrived moments later, accompanied by Lisa Monroe. David acknowledged Stephanie with a brief nod, nothing more. There was no need for reassurance. The documents were already doing their work. When the bailiff called the case, Stephanie rose carefully, mindful of her body. She did not carry the babies inside. They were with a court-approved caregiver nearby. That absence felt strange, but she understood the necessity. This room required clarity. The judge, Eleanor Brooks, listened more than she spoke. Michael's attorney opened with confidence, framing the situation as a misunderstanding between spouses exacerbated by stress and miscommunication. He spoke of abandonment, of unilateral decisions, of a husband trying to maintain stability for his children while his wife acted impulsively. Stephanie watched Judge Brooks's pen move steadily across the page. When David Reynolds stood, he did not mirror the tone. He did not accuse. He laid out a timeline. He referenced the trust, the protective clause, the removal without judicial order, the recorded statement captured on the doorbell camera. He did not play the video yet. He simply established that it existed. Judge Brooks looked up for the first time. "Is access to the property currently denied?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," David replied. "On what basis?" the judge asked, turning to Michael's attorney. Michael's attorney hesitated. There was a disagreement, he said. Mr. White believed space was necessary. Judge Brooks did not react outwardly. "Space," she repeated. "From the primary residence, with newborn children." Michael shifted in his seat. Stephanie kept her gaze forward. The judge issued temporary orders swiftly. Stephanie was granted primary physical custody pending further proceedings. Michael was instructed to cease all direct contact outside of counsel. A civil standby was authorized should Stephanie need to retrieve belongings or documentation. Judge Brooks did not rule on ownership that day. She did not need to. "Property issues will be addressed at the next hearing," she said. "Until then, no changes to occupancy status without court approval." Michael exhaled sharply as if that alone were an injustice. Outside the courtroom, Michael confronted Stephanie for the first time in weeks. "This isn't over," he said under his breath. Stephanie did not respond. David stepped slightly between them, not physically, but symbolically. "All communication through counsel," he said calmly. Michael scoffed and walked away. The afternoon passed in controlled motion. Stephanie retrieved several essential items from the house with a sheriff present: documents, baby supplies, personal effects. Michael stayed upstairs audible, but unseen, his movements sharp and restless. Stephanie did not look for him. As she packed the final box, she paused briefly in the nursery. The room looked unchanged. The mobile still hung over the crib. The chair by the window still bore the indentation of nights she had spent rocking and feeding. She did not linger. Back at the motel, exhaustion finally reached her. Not the sudden kind. The deep, settling fatigue that came from sustained alertness, finally releasing its grip. Stephanie fed the babies, changed them, and lay down on the bed, fully clothed, her eyes closing, before she could decide to rest. When she woke, it was dark outside. Her phone held several notifications: missed calls, voicemails, emails. She reviewed them one by one. Michael had left 3 voicemails in quick succession, anger giving way to pleading, then back again. "You're tearing this family apart. You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't how it was supposed to go." Stephanie saved them all. David had sent a brief update. "Next hearing scheduled. We're on solid ground." Lisa had added a note beneath it: "He's unraveling. Stay consistent." Stephanie appreciated the reminder. That night, as she rocked the babies to sleep, she felt something she had not allowed herself since the night she was forced into the cold. Stillness, not peace, not yet. But a pause in the internal vigilance that had driven her for days. The system was moving now. She did not need to push it. Michael, she knew, would not accept the loss of certainty easily. He would look for ways to regain control through paperwork, through perception, through pressure. But the court had drawn a boundary, and boundaries once established changed behavior, whether people agreed with them or not. Stephanie laid the babies down and stood by the window, looking out at the darkened parking lot. Cars passed intermittently, headlights cutting brief paths through the night. She thought of the house again, not as a possession, but as a symbol of what had been assumed without verification. Michael had believed authority was something he could declare. Stephanie had learned it was something you proved. And in that quiet courtroom, without spectacle or raised voices, the direction of proof had shifted. After the first hearing, time began to behave differently. The days did not slow, but they separated. Each one arrived with a defined purpose, like a sequence of tasks that required attention but not emotion. Stephanie White moved through them with the same measured focus she had once brought to professional projects, identifying dependencies, tracking progress, documenting outcomes. The next phase belonged almost entirely to paper. David Reynolds warned her in advance. "This is where people get impatient," he said during a brief call the morning after the hearing. "Nothing looks dramatic on the surface, but this is where most cases are decided." Stephanie understood. She had lived long enough inside systems to know that visible conflict was rarely where power shifted. The financial disclosures arrived first. Michael was required to submit a full accounting of assets, liabilities, income, and expenditures. The deadline was firm. Extensions were not automatic. He missed the first one. His attorney requested additional time, citing difficulty gathering records. Judge Brooks granted a short extension without comment. Stephanie noted the delay not as a victory, but as a signal. When the disclosures finally arrived, David called her immediately. "There are inconsistencies," he said, "not errors, patterns." They met that afternoon in David's office. Lisa Monroe had already prepared a comparison spreadsheet lining Michael's reported figures against bank records obtained through subpoena. The differences were not explosive. They were incremental. Small amounts shifted between accounts. Credit card balances that did not align with spending histories. A personal line of credit that had not been disclosed at all. Individually, Lisa said, tapping the screen, none of this would raise alarms. Collectively, it suggests concealment. Stephanie studied the data carefully. "Here," she said, pointing to a column. "This transfer, this happened the week I was in the hospital." David nodded. "That timing matters," he said. "It speaks to intent." They moved on to the refinance documents next. An independent expert had reviewed the paperwork Michael had relied on to assert authority over the house. The findings were precise and unemotional. Stephanie had signed while heavily medicated within days of a medical procedure. There was no record of independent counsel, no documentation confirming she had been advised of her rights as a trust beneficiary. "This doesn't invalidate the document outright," David explained, "but it weakens its enforceability significantly." Stephanie felt no satisfaction in hearing that. Only confirmation. The audio files came next. David recommended she be present for their formal review, even though she had already heard them privately. In court, context mattered. They listened in sequence. Michael's voice, captured over months and years, remained consistent in tone, even as circumstances changed. When Stephanie asked questions, his responses grew dismissive. When she pressed for clarity, his language turned corrective. When she mentioned the children, he reframed control as responsibility. Stephanie listened, without visible reaction. At one point, David paused the recording. "This establishes a pattern," he said. "Not abuse in the criminal sense, but coercion." Stephanie nodded. "That's what it felt like," she said quietly. By midweek, Michael's behavior outside the legal process began to deteriorate. He violated the communication order, once sending a message directly to Stephanie late at night. "You think the judge cares about some technicality? I built that life." Stephanie did not respond. She forwarded the message to David. David filed a notice of violation the next morning. Michael's attorney objected, calling it an overreaction. Judge Brooks did not agree. The court issued a written warning. Any further violations would carry consequences. Stephanie felt the pressure release slightly, not because Michael had been punished, but because the boundary had been reinforced. That afternoon, she met with a court-appointed custody evaluator. The evaluator was thorough, neutral, unsentimental. She asked about routine support systems, medical care. She observed Stephanie with the babies, noting how she handled feeding and soothing without interruption or hesitation. When asked about the motel, Stephanie answered honestly. "It's temporary," she said. "It's safe. And it's what I have right now." The evaluator nodded and made a note. "She's calm," the evaluator later remarked to David. "Focused, not defensive." Michael's evaluation did not go as smoothly. He arrived late again. He spoke at length about his frustrations about being misunderstood, about the unfairness of the process. He referenced the house repeatedly, his language revealing a continued assumption of ownership. "That's telling," the evaluator later said. "He equates stability with control." By Friday, the picture had clarified. The trust documentation was airtight. The removal was documented. The financial inconsistencies were established. The communication violations were logged. The custody evaluation favored continuity and restraint. Stephanie felt no urge to celebrate. Instead, she felt something else settle in a sense of inevitability. Michael's version of events required constant reinforcement. It relied on perception, on intimidation, on urgency. Stephanie's version required only patience. That evening, as she folded baby clothes in the motel room, her phone buzzed with an email from David. "We're ready for the final hearing." She closed the laptop and sat on the edge of the bed, the folded clothes stacked neatly beside her. The babies slept, their faces soft and untroubled. Stephanie thought briefly of the early years of her marriage, of how easily she had accepted explanations without documentation, assurances, without verification. She did not regret those choices. Regret implied fault. She understood now that trust without structure was simply exposure. Michael had mistaken her silence for ignorance. The law had not. When Stephanie lay down that night, she did not replay conversations or anticipate confrontations. She did not imagine outcomes. She slept. And in that sleep, there was no fear of waking up displaced again. The system was already correcting itself. The day the county records updated did not announce itself with noise. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no public acknowledgement of what had just changed. It arrived the way most irreversible shifts did, through an automated system, a timestamp, and a line of text that could not be argued with. Stephanie White learned about it while standing in line at a grocery store. She had brought the babies with her, strapped securely into their carriers, their small heads lolling gently as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The store smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and baked bread. Ordinary, unremarkable. That was how she preferred it. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. She did not reach for it immediately. She waited until she had paid, until she had loaded the bags into the car, until the babies were settled again. Only then did she check the screen. An email from Lisa Monroe. Subject, recording confirmed. Effective immediately, Stephanie opened it slowly. The message was brief, precise. It confirmed that the county recorder had officially updated the chain of title. The trust's ownership was now unmistakable in public record. All associated institutions had been notified automatically. The house, Michael's house, as he still thought of it, was no longer ambiguous in any legal sense. Stephanie closed the email and sat quietly in the driver's seat for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She did not smile. She did not exhale in relief. The change felt less like victory and more like gravity reasserting itself. She drove back to the motel. By the time she arrived, the consequences were already rippling outward. Her phone rang. Andrew Miller's name appeared on the screen. "I wanted you to hear this from me," he said after she answered. "Any pending or proposed loans tied to the property are now formally declined. Title's clear. There's no room for interpretation." "Thank you," Stephanie said. Andrew hesitated. "He came in this morning," he added. Demanded an explanation. Stephanie did not ask what Michael had said. She did not need the details. "I appreciate the call," she replied. Within the hour, Michael's reaction arrived. First as text messages, short, fragmented, increasingly agitated. "What is this? Why is my account restricted?" "You went behind my back." Stephanie read each message once. She took screenshots. She did not reply. Then the call came. She answered this one. "You froze everything," Michael said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You can't do that." "I didn't freeze anything," Stephanie replied. "The record updated. That house is mine," he said. Stephanie paused, choosing her words carefully. "No," she said. "You live there." The line went silent for a beat. "You planned this," Michael said finally. Stephanie did not deny it. "I prepared," she said. "There's a difference." She ended the call before he could respond. That afternoon, David Reynolds filed a supplemental notice with the court, formally documenting the updated title status and attaching the county record confirmation. It was not a request. It was an update. Judge Brooks acknowledged receipt within hours. Michael's attorney attempted to object. The objection went nowhere. Without legal ambiguity, Michael's position collapsed quickly. His emergency motion was denied. His claims of authority over the property were now unsupported by record. The language of the court's response was restrained but unmistakable. Ownership is not a matter of belief. Stephanie read the order twice, then closed the file. That evening, she returned to the house for the first time since the night she was forced out. Not alone. A sheriff's deputy stood nearby, hands clasped loosely in front of him, posture neutral. A locksmith waited with his tools ready, though they would not be needed. The locks had already been changed this time, with court approval. Michael was there when she arrived. He stood on the front lawn, arms crossed, his expression caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. He did not approach her. He did not speak at first. Stephanie stepped past him without hesitation. The door opened easily. Inside the house smelled the same. Cleaner, coffee, something faintly artificial Michael favored. The familiar sounds, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator registered without emotion. Stephanie moved through the rooms methodically. She did not inspect. She did not linger. She collected what mattered, the baby's things, her documents, the items she would need to move forward. Michael watched from the doorway of the living room. "You think this means you won," he said. Stephanie paused, turning to face him. "This isn't about winning," she said. "It's about ending." He scoffed. "You'll regret this," he said. Stephanie did not respond. She finished packing. She nodded once to the deputy. She left without looking back. That night back at the motel, Stephanie fed the babies and laid them down. The room felt smaller now. Not because it was inadequate, but because it was temporary in a way it had not been before. Her phone buzzed one last time. An email from Michael's attorney. Proposal to discuss settlement. Stephanie forwarded it to David without comment. David replied later, "We'll handle it. You don't need to engage." Stephanie turned off the phone and sat quietly in the dim light, listening to her children breathe. The house had changed hands, not with confrontation, but with documentation. Michael had lost control not because he was exposed publicly, but because the structure he relied on had never been real. Stephanie felt no satisfaction in that realization. Only clarity. The final hearing took place on a morning that felt deliberately ordinary. Stephanie White noticed that first the way the sky outside the courthouse was pale and undecided, neither bright nor threatening. The kind of morning people forgot by afternoon. She appreciated that. Moments that altered the direction of a life did not need dramatic weather to announce themselves. She arrived early, as she always did now. David Reynolds and Lisa Monroe were already seated at the counsel table, folders aligned neatly, laptops closed but ready. Stephanie sat behind them, hands folded, posture relaxed but attentive. Michael White arrived just before proceedings began. He looked different this time. The confidence that once preceded him like a shield had thinned. His suit was still expensive, his posture still upright, but there was a sharpness to his movements now, an impatience that betrayed strain. He avoided Stephanie's eyes entirely. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered without delay. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. There were no opening statements. This was not a trial in the theatrical sense. This was a reckoning of records. David stood first. He did not raise his voice. He did not frame the hearing as a moral argument. He presented a sequence: the trust documentation, the county record update, the doorbell footage, the communication timeline, the financial disclosures and inconsistencies. Each item was introduced, verified, and admitted. When the doorbell video played, the courtroom remained silent. Michael's voice carried clearly through the speakers. "This isn't your house anymore." The timestamp glowed in the corner of the screen. Stephanie watched Judge Brooks closely, not for reaction, but for attention. The judge did not look at Michael. She looked at the screen, at the documentation attached, at the pattern the evidence formed, without commentary. Next came the testimony. Helen Carter took the stand. She was nervous, visibly so, but she spoke plainly. She described what she had seen Stephanie leaving after midnight, carrying newborns, a lone suitcase is already outside. She described Michael's voice raised insistent. She described the stillness of the street afterward. I didn't know what to do, Helen said quietly. But I knew it wasn't right. Michael's attorney cross-examined briefly, attempting to frame Helen's account as incomplete, speculative. Judge Brooks stopped him after 2 questions. The witness has described what she observed, the judge said. That is sufficient. The custody evaluator's report was entered next. It did not praise Stephanie. It did not condemn Michael. It described behavior's response's consistency. It recommended continuity of care and noted concerns regarding Michael's fixation on property as a measure of stability. Michael shifted in his seat. When his attorney rose to respond, the argument lacked structure. He spoke of intent, of misunderstandings, of emotional reactions taken out of context. He referenced Michael's role as provider repeatedly, as if repetition might substitute for proof. Judge Brooks listened without interruption. When Michael's attorney finished, the judge addressed Michael directly. "Mr. White," she said, "do you wish to speak?" Michael stood. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quickly. "I just want to say I never meant to put my children at risk. Everything I did was for this family." Judge Brooks studied him for a moment. "You removed your wife and newborn children from their residence after midnight," she said, "without court order, without alternative accommodation. Do you dispute that?" Michael hesitated. "I didn't think answer the question," the judge said calmly. "No," Michael said. "I don't dispute it." Judge Brooks nodded once. She looked back down at the file in front of her, flipping a page slowly. "This court does not adjudicate intentions," she said. "It adjudicates actions and authority." She began reading her ruling. The house was confirmed as trust property under Stephanie White's sole beneficial interest. Michael White had no legal claim to ownership or control. His removal of Stephanie and the children constituted unlawful exclusion. His subsequent attempts to leverage financial institutions and public narrative were noted but irrelevant to legal standing. Primary physical and legal custody of the children was awarded to Stephanie, with supervised visitation to be arranged pending compliance with court directives. Michael was ordered to vacate the property permanently within a set time frame. Any further violations of court orders would result in sanctions. Judge Brooks did not look up as she finished. "So ordered." The gavel struck once, that was all. There was no reaction from the gallery, no gasps, no visible relief from Stephanie. She remained seated, her hands still folded, her breathing steady. Michael stood frozen for a moment, as if waiting for something else to happen, for an appeal, a clarification, a reversal. Nothing came. Outside the courtroom, the hallway filled with low murmurs as other cases moved forward. Life continued immediately indifferent to the outcome just delivered. Michael's attorney spoke to him urgently, gesturing toward a side corridor. Michael nodded numbly and followed, his shoulders rigid. David Reynolds turned to Stephanie. "It's done," he said. Stephanie nodded, not because she was relieved, but because the word fit. Later that afternoon, Stephanie walked out of the courthouse alone. She did not pause on the steps. She did not look back. She simply moved forward, the weight she had carried for weeks, now redistributed into something lighter, more manageable. Her phone buzzed as she reached the car. A message from David. "We'll finalize the settlement details next. You don't need to do anything tonight." Stephanie thanked him and set the phone aside. As she drove back to the motel, she did not replay the hearing. She did not rehearse what she might say if Michael contacted her again. She thought instead about logistics, housing options, school districts, routines that would need to be built from scratch. That evening, she fed the babies and held them longer than usual, not out of fear, but out of presence. She allowed herself to sit still to feel the moment without scanning for the next threat. The house, the marriage, the life she had once tried to maintain through silence, those chapters were closed now. Not with bitterness, but with finality. Michael had lost not because he was humiliated, but because he was mistaken. Stephanie had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. Stephanie White returned to the house one final time, 3 days after the ruling. This time, there was no deputy, no locksmith, no paperwork to exchange at the door. The legal authority had already done its work. What remained was practical, quiet, unremarkable, and deeply personal. The house stood the same as it always had. The maple tree in the front yard had begun to lose its leaves, red and gold, scattered across the lawn. Stephanie noticed how ordinary it looked from the outside, how easily it could have been mistaken for a place where nothing significant had ever happened. She unlocked the door and stepped inside alone. The air was still carrying the faint echo of Michael's presence, his preferred cleaning products, the sharp scent of aftershave that lingered in the hallway. Stephanie paused just inside the entryway, allowing herself one breath to register the familiarity without attachment. She did not walk through the house like someone reclaiming territory. She walked through it like someone closing an account. Room by room, she assessed what mattered. Not furniture, not decor, not the artifacts of a life that had been built on imbalance. She gathered documents Michael had left behind, tax records, insurance policies, correspondence that would need to be forwarded through counsel. She boxed the last of the baby's things she had not been able to retrieve earlier. In the living room, she stopped briefly. The indentation on the sofa where she had sat during late-night feedings was still visible. The lamp beside it bore a small scratch she remembered making with a stroller frame months earlier. These were not sentimental details. They were data points, evidence of time, spent energy given. She did not sit down. Upstairs, the bedroom felt emptier than she expected. Michael had already removed most of his belongings, leaving behind hangers swaying slightly in the closet. Stephanie did not open the drawers. She did not need to see what was gone. In the nursery, she paused again. The mobile still turned slowly in the current from the vent, its soft shape circling without purpose. Stephanie reached up and stopped it gently, then lowered her hand. She did not cry. Crying would have implied loss. What she felt instead was completion. She carried the final box downstairs and set it by the door. Before leaving, she took one last look at the space, not with longing, but with clarity. The house had never been the source of her safety. She locked the door behind her and placed the keys in her bag, already knowing she would not use them again. That afternoon, she met with David Reynolds to discuss next steps. The settlement terms were straightforward. Michael would receive no claim to the property. His visitation would remain supervised until further review. All communication would continue through counsel. David spoke carefully, mindful of the emotional weight such conversations often carried. "You have options," he said. "You can keep the house. You can sell it. You can place it into a long-term trust for the children." Stephanie did not answer immediately. She had thought about this already late at night while feeding the babies, while listening to their breathing anchor the room. "I don't want to live there," she said finally. "But I don't want to rush either." "That's wise," David said. "We can hold it. Let it serve its purpose without defining your next step." Stephanie nodded. That evening, she returned to the motel and began packing, not in haste, but with intention. She had secured a short-term rental near a medical center and a park, a place that would support routines rather than memories. The move was quiet. No announcements, no explanations. Michael did not contact her again. When the last bag was loaded into the car, Stephanie stood for a moment in the empty motel room. It felt different now. Not like a refuge, but like a threshold that had served its purpose. She locked the door and left the key at the front desk. The new place was smaller than the house. Fewer rooms, less history. Stephanie noticed immediately how the light filled the space differently, how the walls felt neutral rather than heavy. She set the babies down and opened the windows. That night after the babies slept, Stephanie sat alone at the small table and opened a new notebook. The old one, filled with dates and documentation, was complete. This one was blank. She did not write plans. She did not write reflections. She wrote a single line. "Stability does not come from staying, it comes from choosing." In the days that followed, the outside world adjusted to the ruling in subtle ways. Banks updated records, insurance policies were amended, School districts were contacted not for enrollment yet, but for information. Michael's name faded from her administrative life, replaced by neutral identifiers and legal language. Stephanie did not speak about the case unless necessary. When asked, she responded simply. It was resolved. People often waited for more. She did not provide it. One afternoon, as she walked with the stroller through the nearby park, she noticed how easily the babies slept in the open air, how their bodies responded to rhythm and movement rather than walls. She thought of the house again, not with resentment, but with distance. It had been a container, nothing more. The life she was building now required less space and more intention. Stephanie continued to move forward without ceremony, her days structured around care, documentation, and recovery. She did not seek validation. She did not revisit old arguments in her mind. The story, as far as she was concerned, was finished. What remained was living. Stephanie White did not announce her departure from the old life. There was no final conversation, no carefully worded message meant to summarize what had happened or assign meaning to it. Endings, she had learned, did not require witnesses to be real. They required closure, and closure was something you constructed quietly, piece by piece. The weeks after the ruling unfolded with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar at first. Not easy, not light, just stable. Stephanie settled into the new rental without urgency. The space was temporary by design, and she treated it that way. Furniture was minimal, nothing hung on the walls yet. The priority was function-clear walkways, soft lighting, predictable routines for the babies. Morning feeds, midday walks, medical follow-ups, sleep when it came. Her body continued to heal in stages. Some days were easier than others. On the difficult days, she allowed herself to rest without apology. She no longer felt the need to justify fatigue or explain limits. Recovery, she understood now, was not something you earned. It was something you honored. David Reynolds checked in periodically, keeping her informed of administrative closures, final filings, confirmations, acknowledgments. Each update shortened the distance between past and future. One afternoon, he called with a final matter. The trust needs direction, he said. Not immediately, but eventually. Stephanie knew what he meant. The house remained in the trust untouched, its value intact. It could be sold. It could be leased. It could be held until the children were older. It was no longer a symbol of conflict. It was an asset. Neutral. Patient. I want it placed into a long-term holding structure for the kids, Stephanie said. Education, healthcare, security. No rush to liquidate. David smiled, though she could only hear it in his voice. That aligns with your mother's intent, he said. Stephanie thanked him and ended the call. That night, after the babies were asleep, she sat alone by the window, watching the lights from the street below blur slightly in the glass. She allowed herself to think not about Michael, but about the version of herself that had existed inside that marriage. She did not judge that woman. She understood her. She had trusted. She had adapted. She had believed that endurance was a form of strength. In many ways, it had been. It had kept her children safe long enough for the law to do what it was designed to do. Michael White did not disappear entirely from her awareness. Occasionally, his name surfaced in administrative contexts, an address update here, a compliance notice there. All communication remained filtered through counsel. There were no violations, no last attempts at control. Whatever certainty he had once drawn from dominance had evaporated under scrutiny. Stephanie did not take satisfaction in that. She took distance. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Stephanie received a final envelope from the court. Inside was a copy of the fully executed order, custody, finalized property, settled obligations defined. She placed it in a folder and filed it away. Not prominently, not ceremoniously. It joined the archive of things she no longer needed to revisit. Life expanded gradually. She began exploring longer-term housing options, not large, not impressive. Just practical, close to parks, near schools, accessible to medical care. She thought in terms of proximity now, not appearance. When friends asked how she was doing, she answered honestly but briefly. "We're stable," she said. Stability, she had learned, was not a feeling. It was a condition. One morning, as she watched the baby sleep, three small bodies aligned in quiet synchronization, Stephanie felt something shift again. Not a reversal, not a revelation. Acceptance. The past no longer demanded interpretation. It simply existed as fact. The future did not need to be predicted. It only needed to be prepared for. She stood stretched carefully and began the day. There was no moment of triumph, no internal monologue declaring strength regained. There was just movement forward, deliberate and unremarkable. And that, she realized, was the most honest ending she could have chosen. Stephanie White did not leave with revenge. She left with structure, with documentation, with dignity. Some stories end with confrontation, others end with applause. This one ends with quiet. What Stephanie's journey reveals is not the drama of betrayal, but the anatomy of power, how it is often assumed, rarely verified, and ultimately governed not by volume, but by record. There was no moment where she needed to raise her voice, shame her opponent, or reclaim her worth through spectacle. Instead, she observed. She documented. She waited. And in that waiting, systems designed to protect, not punish, did what they were meant to do. Justice, when it arrives quietly, often feels incomplete to those who expect fireworks. But for those who live inside its outcome, quiet is the point. Quiet is safety. Quiet is room to breathe. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever watched someone mistake control for authority or silence for weakness, you're not alone. Stories like this exist not to entertain, but to remind us that dignity does not need witnesses to be real. If you feel moved, you're welcome to share where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Different places, different hours, yet the same truths tend to surface everywhere. And if you value stories about quiet strength, legal clarity, and justice that doesn't shout, consider subscribing. More stories like this are waiting. Some endings don't echo, they settle.